Hey, Clayton here. In this tutorial, we're going to go over the process of how to actually generate a normal map texture from a diffuse texture using the Photoshop plugin Endu. Now, the website that I'm on now, if you want to follow along, is cgtextures.com. This is the go-to website to actually find a whole bunch of an entire library of photo-sourced reference textures. And to be honest, every time I want to start creating a diffuse texture, I'll go here, download 3 or 4 of these textures and load them up into Photoshop, ready to compose them into a diffuse texture of my own. When I say diffuse texture, what I'm actually referring to is the base texture that you're going to be applying to the geometry in your game. Okay, so it holds all the base information of color and kind of material and that kind of thing, but it doesn't have any actual shaders attached to it, so no kind of shiny specular maps, no bumpy normal maps or anything. It's just like a base color, base material texture. Okay. Back in the day when you were playing games like Half-Life and Quake and Doom, this is what we were dealing with, just solely diffuse textures that were basically, you know, any shadows or highlights that we wanted to see on that texture would have to literally be painted out by hand. Of course, in this day and age, we're lucky enough to have specular maps and normal maps and alpha maps and glow maps and a whole bunch of different kinds of maps. You know, we're seeing more and more maps come out that are even more technological than we've ever seen before. But for this particular tutorial, we'll just be focusing on normal maps. And I'm going to take you through that process. Now, what normal maps will allow you to do is incorporate a higher level of detail onto a low polygon model. Okay? So a low polygon model, because you're dealing with a real-time game environment, isn't actually going to be able to hold a high polygon density. In turn, this means that you will not be able to incorporate a lot of detail onto that low polygon model alone. And even with a highly detailed diffuse texture, the lighting is not going to be able to pick up all those intricate details in real time. And what allows us to do this is normal maps. So what normal maps hold is basically a whole bunch of height map information containing all the little tiny details, all the tiny intricate details like the wrinkles and the pimples and the skin texture and the material and weaving on the clothing and everything else. It holds all these tiny details within this normal map, and it allows the rendering, the lighting in that real-time game rendering engine to pick up on those details real time, giving the illusion of more detail than there actually is. Now, back into Photoshop, what I'm doing here is I'm creating a 2048 by 2048 new document in Photoshop, and this is going to be basically where I'm composing and constructing my diffuse texture. So I'm going to take you through the process of creating the diffuse texture first, and then we're going to generate a normal map from that diffuse texture. What I've just placed in first is the base cement texture that I downloaded from cgtextures.com. Now I'm copying over the cement overlay texture that I'm going to put into my diffuse texture. Copied it into the wrong document there. So we're in the right document now. I'm going to paste it in here, and then I'm going to hit Control-T on my keyboard to resize it to the desired scale. What I'm doing is I'm just taking the 2 or 3 textures that I downloaded from cgtextures.com, and I'm pasting them all into this texture document that I've created, ready for compositioning, if that's a word. And I make sure to name my layers as well, because when you're composing these diffuse textures, there can be a lot of layers and a lot of information, a lot of effects and that kind of stuff that you might want to use to create this awesome diffuse texture. Now, if you haven't named them properly, you're going to get kind of confused and probably end up spending more time than you would have to otherwise spend trying to figure out what layer you're supposed to be working on. Now the other important thing to note is what I've actually done is I've put in a base color underneath the other layers. So you'll notice the layer above the background layer is the base color. That's going to give me an overall color harmony to the texture. Above that you've got the base material texture. In this case it's a cement kind of texture which is set to multiply, and the top layer is an overlay texture, again of a kind of cement material, which is overlaid on top of that base material and the base color, just to add a little bit of interest, just to add a little bit more of a dynamic material to this diffuse texture that we're working on here. And I'm just going to adjust the opacity a little bit because I don't want it to be too intense. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to this metal kind of texture that I downloaded from cgtextures.com, and I'm just going to copy a few bits and pieces from it to create a kind of metal lining along the bottom of this wall diffuse texture. Again, I'm going to hit Ctrl T on my keyboard to allow me to bring up the transform tools and kind of manipulate it to the position and scale that I want it to be at. And I'm going to take that layer and drop it just below that top overlay cement material that I have over the entire texture. And then I'm going to go into the hue and saturation menu and kind of just tweak that metal so that it blends in a little bit more with the base diffuse composition that I've been working on so far. So you can see that I've changed it from this kind of cool blue hue to a brown, warm, sandy, rusty type of color. Now the layer style menu that I've just brought up here, which you can bring up by just double clicking on your layer. So just double click on the little thumbnail image in your layer, and what you'll get is the layer style menu that basically gives you a whole bunch of options that will allow you to basically add different kinds of effects to that particular layer. In this case, I've added a drop shadow to the metal lining across the bottom of the floor. And what that will kind of do is it'll give the illusion that that metal lining is kind of popping out a little bit. Okay, so it adds a little bit of extra dimension to it. Kind of ambient occlusion, if you will, or an ambient shadow. And now I'm adding a bit of a bevel emboss to kind of bring out the three-dimensionality of that metal lining. And it really does make such a difference. It's kind of subtle at first and you might not really notice, but if you just switch those on and off by ticking the box on and off, you'll actually find that it does make a huge difference in the kind of depth that those layer styles can add to the particular layer that you're working on. So what I've done is I've just copied another piece of that metal material and I'm putting it up the top of my diffuse wall here, on my base texture wall, and using the transform tool to scale it up to the position that I want it to be at, the size I want it to be at. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into image adjustments, hue and saturation, and I'm just going to change up the hue a little bit more so that it blends in more appropriately to the base diffuse that I already have there. Then I'm going to adjust the brightness and contrast to bring its values down to a more suitable level. Then I'm going to go into the layer styling menu of this layer and I'm going to basically do what I did for the bottom metal lining. I'm just going to add a drop shadow to it. And then again, it kind of makes it look like it's it gives that three-dimensionality to the different elements of that texture. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the entire metal material and I'm just going to overlay it over the whole texture that I've created here. And what this will allow me to do is kind of add a damp, mossy, kind of slimy looking effect to my wall. And the way that I'm going to achieve that is I'm going to go into the layer style menu. I'm going to go into the image adjustments menu and just change up the levels a little bit, well actually a lot, to the point where there's a very high contrast between the black and the white. Okay, so I'm just bringing together really tightly, and then I'm going to basically change the layer type to a multiply, which will give me this kind of effect. And at the moment it kind of looks like rust or dirt splattered over the walls, but once I go into the adjustments and change up the hue a little bit and the saturation, I'm actually going to change it to like this kind of slimy green color. Okay, and what do you know? Now I've got some moss on my wall. Then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to duplicate this moss layer. After, of course, I change the opacity a little bit. Don't want it too intense. And I'm going to duplicate that layer. I'm going to flip it horizontally by hitting Control T and right clicking, flip horizontal. Oh, sorry, flip vertical and horizontal. And I'm going to take it up to the top of the wall so that I've got a bit of moss coming down from the ceiling as well. And again, this just kind of adds, interesting and kind of cool details to the diffuse texture. What will allow the lighting system to actually pick up on these little tiny details is the normal maps that I'm going to generate from this diffuse texture. Okay, so finally I'm going to add like a 3D pillar that is placed right in the center of this wall. And the way I'm going to do that is the same way that I create all of the kind of 3D effects in these diffuse textures, which is basically creating a selection, filling that selection with white, then adjusting it as I need to, trimming it up where it needs to be trimmed. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click on the thumbnail of that layer and go into the layer styling menu and add in an inner shadow, like so. Increase the size a little bit, decrease the distance, and increase the choke amounts. Then I'm going to go down to drop shadow, and again I'm going to adjust the distance, increase the size. And what you'll notice is that this kind of 3D this kind of white selection now looks a little bit more 3D. It kind of has this depth to it. Now I'm going to actually take that layer down, a few layers down, below the overlay textures, and I'm just going to change its layer type to multiply. And what you'll find is now it's almost like we have this kind of 3D extension to our wall. And I'm going to tweak it up a little bit by adjusting the size and the choke amount and the layer style on the inner shadow. When I'm happy with it, I'm just going to click OK. And trim it up a little bit more as I need to. Sometimes you have to tweak it a little bit just to get it the way that you want it to be. And once that's done, our diffuse texture is basically ready to go. The next step will be creating what I like to call a normal map template. Now, oh, by the way, what I've just done there is I've actually selected all the different elements inside my diffuse texture, all the layers, and I've just merged them all down into all the one layer. Okay, so the entire diffuse texture is a singular layer right now. Okay, now we could actually save this diffuse texture out and basically apply it to a wall in our game, in our level, and it would work, but the lighting wouldn't actually bring up any of the little details that we've incorporated into it. So again, back to the normal map template that we're going to create here. The normal map template is basically a grayscale value layer that defines all the main areas of our diffuse texture. Okay, so basically the four main areas that we have here is the wall pillar, and the two metal linings at the top and the bottom of that wall. Okay, now these are the areas, or the main areas, that we want the normal map to actually pick up. Okay, and so that these main areas are defined and not caught up in the rest of the intricate details inside this map, we're going to create a normal map template for them that we will use to generate the initial normal map, and then we will create a second normal map with all the intricate details on that'll be overlaid on top of that that base normal map. Okay, so think of it this way: we've got a normal map that has been generated from this diffuse map that defines all the main key areas of the normal map. And then we've got a second normal map overlaid on top of that normal map that is basically responsible for all the tiny intricate details that aren't really, you know, big shapes or really definitive elements of that diffuse texture, but kind of, you know, add the bumps and grooves and the details that we're really looking for. So I'm going to start creating this grayscale normal map template, which is basically a height map, meaning that the lowest point of that map is going to be the darkest value, and the lightest point, or the highest point of that map, will be the lightest value. Okay, so it'll go from dark to light. Basically what I've done is I've got the wall there, and it's going to be the darkest value, so it's going to be a dark grey. And the way that I'm creating these selections, I'm just getting my selection tool, and I'm selecting, for example, this central pillar, and then I'm just filling it with a grayscale value. Okay, so you can see that that pillar is actually lighter than the wall below it. Okay, meaning that when we generate the normal map from this, that pillar is going to be sticking out further from the wall rather than sticking into the wall, if that makes sense. Now, if we go with this same principle, what we are going to want is these metal supports to be sticking out further from the wall and from the pillar. So it's going to be the lightest value, if you will. It's going to make a new layer for these metal supports, and they're going to be the highest value. So they're pretty close to white, actually. I'm just going to fill that in, like so. Okay, and that's basically our normal map template completed. You know, I'm adjusting the values a little bit, but all in all, it's pretty much ready to go, ready for NDo to generate a normal map from it. Now this is actually the original NDo that I'm going to be using here, by the way. I haven't really used NDo 2 too much, and so the workflow for that may be a little bit different to what I'm showing you here. But of course, you know, they've got a whole bunch of tutorials and information on it that you can use. So basically, you want to make sure that NDo is installed on your C drive, drag the action over into the Actions tab on Photoshop, and then just hit the play button on the NDo Teddy action. It'll ask you for a whole bunch of options. You know, do you want to bevel it? Do you want it to tile? I clicked yes for both in this situation, in this example. And what you'll find is NDo very quickly creates and generates a normal map based on whatever layer you have selected at the time. You can adjust the radius and the kind of scaling options that NDo has available for you to kind of tweak the normal map as you need to. But other than that, that's how simple it is. Now we've got the main areas of our diffuse texture normal mapped. We're going to go back and we're going to generate a normal map that holds the information to all the kind of more minute, less significant details. Okay, and we're going to go through the same process. I'm just going to duplicate that layer. I'm going to hit the Undo Teddy action button and generate the normal map. And you can see the massive amount of details that Undo has actually incorporated into this normal map compared to the previous one. Now what we're going to do is I'm actually going to take this highly detailed normal map, I'm going to merge it together, and hang on a second. Nope, I'm going to do it all over again. So just in case you missed it the first time, okay, yes. Okay, so because this is a tiling texture, what we want to do is make sure that it tiles properly before we generate the normal maps. Otherwise, what we will get inside the game is a whole bunch of seams along our wall. Okay, so we want it to tile seamlessly. The way that I create a seamlessly tiling diffuse texture is I use the offset filter in Photoshop to find out where the seam is in the first place. And then the way that I fix that seam is by using the clone stamp tool to basically pick already existing areas of that map and just stamping them over the seam. It's kind of a really quick and harsh way of getting rid of seams, but it works. So again, just hold down Alt to select the area that you want to clone stamp, and then drag it over the area that you want to cover up. I'm going to use it. I always use an airbrush for this, so that kind of, creates a nice gradient blending effect. Okay. So again, hold down Alt to select the area that you want to clone stamp, and then just left click over the seam itself to kind of drop down the area that you've copied with the clone stamp. Another easy way to do this is just to copy part of that texture and then paste it over the seam itself, and then using the eraser tool with a soft airbrush, just erase the edges of that new layer. Okay, and the seam will disappear like that. Okay, now this is basically properly prepared for normal mapping. Now, of course, before you normal map, you should really make sure you got this sorted. I didn't. I had to go back and learn the hard way. But yeah, once that's done, just take the offset back to its original state. Now, the problem is that I've already created a normal map template, and I don't want to have to go back and do it again. So I'm going to have to make sure that, these line up 100% before I continue. The way that I've done that is I've just kind of adjusted the opacity of the normal map layer, and I'm using that as a guide to realign the diffuse texture to the normal map. Now, just make sure you fix your seams before you do the normal mapping, and you won't have to worry about this like I have. I like doing things the hard way, so alright, let's try that again. Now we're ready to generate the normal map again with Undo. Make sure that you've got your Actions tab open. You can find that in the window menu at the top of Photoshop, and just hit the Undo Teddy button and it'll generate a normal map for you. Now, sometimes to kind of get more refined details, you can adjust the radius in Undo. You can adjust the depth. Obviously, if you want to take the depth down, it'll make it less intense. I guess the intensity does that too. You can adjust the opacity somewhat. There's a whole bunch of options that I would basically just encourage you to experiment with a little bit until you get the desired result, the result that you're after. Okay, awesome. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to merge those together into a single normal map, and then I'm going to take that above all the other layers in Photoshop and I'm going to set it as an overlay. Okay, now it's overlaid on top of my diffuse, but as you can see, to turn my opacity up, as you can see, what we've got is the normal template with the normal map template normal mapped with the normal map details overlaid on top of that base normal map template. What that allows us to do is it allows us to keep the main overall shapes very refined and very prominent, while also incorporating those other more intricate yet less significant details on top of it. Now, the reason that it's important to do the normal map template is because if you're just generating a normal map from a diffuse texture, what you will find is that NDo will actually kind of take ambient shadows, or maybe just shadows that shouldn't be there, or highlights that shouldn't be there, and it will generate a normal map based on that. Now, that's probably not the kind of effect that you want to go for. Creating the normal map template actually gives you control over where you want those main shapes in the normal map to be. Leaving it all up to NDo to decide that for you can come up with some pretty nasty looking results. So I wouldn't recommend that route. Put in the time to create the normal map template. This is what they did for Doom 3. This is where I learned the technique from. And you should get very sharp, fairly refined normal maps. Now you can see that ambient shadow that I put onto the diffuse, you know what? NDo actually took that and indented it into the detailed normal map, and you'll see that it's actually created a pretty messed up effect when I load this up into Unity. By the way, I will be actually loading up Unity and creating the material shader for the normal map that I've just created. So we're just going to take a moment here to load up Unity, and then what we're actually going to do is apply this brand new texture that we've created to a wall in this level that I've created. So there's already some textures on here. Cool. This is kind of like the lab, the experimental level, where we apply all of these exercises and basically check out what the results are from the exercises that we're doing here. So what I'm doing is I'm just right-clicking, going into Create Material, create a new material, and I'm just going to call this new wall, make it obvious so I can find it. And I'm going to change the shader to bumped diffuse. Now, I won't actually be able to find these textures just yet. Oh well, look, what do you know, I've already loaded them in there. So I select the diffuse texture for the main color, and then I scroll down and I find the normal map version of that diffuse texture. In Unity, what you actually want to do is you want to hit the Fix Now button on the normal maps, because for some reason Unity doesn't read the normal maps we've generated as proper normal maps. So just hit the Fix Now button, it'll fix it right up for you. If you're using Unity, that is. And then I'm just going to drag it over onto my wall. Okay, and you can see that I've got this really nice normal mapped bumpy looking effect on my wall now. Now let's make it these details a little bit more obvious by using our light to light the details up. Okay, so that actually came out pretty damn good for a little Photoshop plugin that basically generates all of this stuff automatically for you. You can see that again, that ambient shadow coming off the central wall pillar kind of caused the wall to indent right at the intersection of the pillar and the wall itself. But hey, you know what? Next time I'll just have to switch that off and make sure that I render out the details individually. Okay, thanks for listening, guys. I hope this tutorial helped, and I'll see you next time.